So I'm with author, political thinker and head of demography at the Policy Exchange think tank, David Goodhart. Now, a few years ago, 2017, David wrote a very influential book called The Road to Somewhere, which was so influential it actually changed the political lexicon, and we started using the words somewheres and anywheres. But Dave's got a new book out called Head, Hand and Heart, and I'm here to discuss it with him. So, David, first question. What's the premise of the new book? What's it about?
Well, as you say, it's kind of part two to The Road to Somewhere. The Road to Somewhere was mainly about the value divides created partly by the new educational stratification, residential universities and so on. The value divides that had led to modern political alienation, and Brexit, Trump, European populism was a kind of expression of that. And this in a way is part two of that, trying to dig down, trying to understand why it is that so many people in apparently otherwise quite successful societies feel really pretty pissed off. And I think, well, I mean, the explanation is partly in the title, that, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, I mean, you could say this is something that goes back from the beginning of civilization, the fact that we particularly honour the sort of purity of rational thought, and the body is seen as a site of sort of temptation and corruption and so on, I mean, reinforced by Christianity. But no, I mean, but the point is, just in the last 30 or 40 years, we have allocated a hugely disproportionate amount of prestige and indeed reward, returns to qualification, to just one form of human aptitude, cognitive, analytical, kind of exam passing ability, which is a vital human aptitude. Don't get me wrong, high intelligence is absolutely vital, probably more vital than ever before for the human species. We need to work, teams of clever people need to, create a vaccine for COVID and learn how to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and so on and so forth. That's not an issue. But we have created, partly through the huge helter-skelter expansion of higher education in the last 30 or 40 years, a massive sort of cognitive bureaucracy. Many people who go into higher education, who are no more able than the people who don't often, end up in the kind of middling and lower ranks of this kind of expanded cognitive class. They end up feeling, because these things obviously have diminishing returns. They end up feeling pissed off, and their expectations aren't being met by the kind of lower level sort of administrative work they may be doing. Meanwhile, we have absolutely massive skill shortages in the skilled trades, and in particularly the kind of missing middle, the kind of higher technical manual functions, and we have this massive recruitment crisis in the care sector. So we've just got things out of kilter, and it's partly because the kind of the liberal graduate anywhere worldview is very, very oriented towards cognitive priorities, and almost everybody in the higher echelons of politics and economics and culture has been through the mainly residential university system. Their children have, it's just become so much the sort of the common sense of what it is to lead a successful life.
Yes, so there's an extent to which the sort of cognitive elite, the people that have been through university, just see the world in those terms, and then start wanting to reproduce more of that because they think that's success, and they forget about the other side of the tennis net, don't they?
Well, I think so, yes, and it's just that the definition of a successful life has become very narrow. I mean, it involves getting into the A-level stream at school, going to a more or less good university, having a more or less successful, probably cognitive professional career, and there is simply more to life than that. I mean, there is a broader scale of worth. There are different scales of worth, and there are absolutely vital and fulfilling aptitudes associated with with other parts of the human body. The heart and the hand, and I do think we used to have not only has the definition of a successful life narrowed, but the path into it has become go to university.
One ladder up.
One ladder. And there used to be lots of little ladders, and there used to be people who didn't do well at school if they were capable, they would be spotted, and you could have promotion from below in ways that are now impossible. 40% of jobs in the economy are graduate only, and that is expanding. So the whole system has got out of kilter, but it's on a kind of automatic pilot. More kids than ever before are going to go to university this year. Okay, that's partly to do with the pandemic, but we have a higher education system that is no longer. I mean, we do higher education well. I'm not suggesting we should close all the universities, but we have overexpanded, and they're on because they are private corporations. I mean, they are not.
It's in their interest to promote themselves.
I mean, they are partially acting in the public interest, but they're not only acting in the public interest. They have their own, their own vested interests. The more students they have, the more income they have, the more courses they can put on, and in their view, that means the more innovation and the more useful sort of production of knowledge they are making available. But the truth is, only a tiny proportion of people, even in universities, are actually producing new knowledge.
Yeah.
The rest of the cognitive class is sort of piggybacking on this.
It's a rite of passage to some extent, isn't it?
Well, also, yeah.
But don't you think? I mean, if we look at it, so I totally agree with you. There's sort of far too many people going to university, and that has costs. So if you look at the cost, the consequence of the policy. There are two, really, aren't there? There's the consequences of people that are going through that system, being funneled through that system, and you have a problem with expectations. Can they match what they've been given to believe they might get? And then there's also an opportunity cost, because you're putting resources into one particular type of education, neglecting vocational and skills training and other things. Do you think that's a fair appraisal?
Yeah, I think it is. And I mean, I'm sometimes accused of, wanting to sort of kick away the ladder. If you talk about wanting to restrict entry into higher education, you get this sort of elitist accusation thrown back at you. But it seems to me the assumption, as you say, is based on the experiences of the existing elite, many of whom went to university, by the way, when it was a much more elitist and perhaps in some ways more valuable experience. It was before the diminishing returns had set in. And they are comparing their experience with the current experience, which, as you say, is leading to a crisis of expectations for many young people. They go to university, they do what they think they've been told to do, and they get a decent degree from a reasonable university, and then they find they're doing a 22 grand a year job, in the back office somewhere.
That they could have done without going to university.
Exactly, that their non-graduate peers could have easily done that job. Indeed, their non-graduate parents might easily have done the same kind of job. And that is, I think, one of the explanations for some of the recent political eruptions, like sort of Bernie Sanders in America, even the kind of Corbyn momentum movement. A lot of disappointed kind of middle class, lower middle class kids, who thought they were entering this zone of safety and success. To find they're not. They
thought they were going to get dividends that they're not going to get. And actually, I think the actual term, people talk about, a mass elite or, elite overproduction. I don't think you can have a mass elite in that sense. I mean, it's a contradiction, complete contradiction. And what they're doing is giving people expectations that they can't possibly fulfill. And I think there's probably a very, very long tail effect. Certainly, I agree with you on the political consequences in terms of political extremism. Michael Lynn's very good on this. And his recent essays about the BLM movement in the States and the political upheavals you see in places like Portland, actually it's not driven by working class Americans.
No.
It's driven by overeducated, underoccupied, rather privileged people who are really quite angry. I remember I did about 10 years ago when I was at the University in Durham, I did a bit of work on youth bulge theory. And the link between youth bulges, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, and political violence. And it's very interesting that the Erdl and the other academics that looked at it in detail always saw a plus VE for education in terms of political violence.
Really?
Very interesting. We educate people, they won't become violent and unhappy. Actually, that's certainly not true of youth bulge theory. But there is a bigger consequence, isn't it? We neglect all of the other things, vocational training and that.
No, I mean, there's a sort of naivety, about and a belief in the sort of productive power of higher education that is simply not borne out by the facts. Look at what's been happening to productivity. Look also at what's been happening to social mobility. I mean, the idea, if you're seeing universities as a sort of machine of social mobility, then you should close them all down tomorrow, because they have become, in the last, one of the reasons, all the serious social mobility analysts will say, one of the reasons for the slowdown in social mobility has been the middle class and upper middle class monopolisation of higher education. No, it's true. You know, sort of quite a few working class kids these days go to university too, but that is not a justification for continuing to expand a form of education that has become increasingly redundant. I mean, the knowledge economy turns out not to need that many knowledge workers,
and it won't. Looking through the curve.
I mean, this is why. I mean, my book. I mean, when I started writing the book, I thought this was actually rather a kind of idealistic notion, the idea of sort of shifting status from head to hand and heart, even slightly new agey, reinforced by my discovery that head, hand and heart turns out to be the motto of Bedale School, the progressive English public school. But the more I researched it, the more I looked into these things, the more I realised that in a way it's got to happen. It's going to happen anyway because the knowledge economy doesn't need so many knowledge workers. And this is even before AI comes along. You can see it in all, we have the signal of the declining graduate income premium, and it's collapsed for many people, particularly those going to non-elite universities. You have, 30% of graduates not in graduate employment, even 5 to 10 years after. And, if you look at the shrinkage, well, it's not shrinking yet, but the lack of expansion of the sort of managerial professional class. Go back to 2000, the proportion of people in the top two classes, basically kind of higher and lower managerial and professional class, was quite high. It was about 35% of the population. In last year, it was just touching 37%. So it's essentially static. And yet we have these machines called universities producing more and more people for that form of employment.
It's not socially useful. I mean, that's my point.
Some of it is. I mean, at the very highest level.
At the scale, it's been, and that's the point. And the opportunity cost to neglect other. I mean, I'm interested in why do you think vocational skills and training and the heart areas have been neglected by policymakers? I mean, everyone's aware of the graduatisation of politics because I think the last Prime Minister possibly didn't go to university with Jim Callaghan, probably, and there were roots. There were always roots, but that occupation, policymakers come from an entirely graduatised thing, and I think it's inevitable that they just aren't aware of other needs, so they neglect what they're not in contact with, and I think the neglect of basic skills training, because the lack of skills in this particular economy has been known for a long time, but policymakers have done nothing about it. Why are they indifferent to it?
Yeah, I think it is partly a cultural thing. I mean, the sort of cultural domination of a kind of Oxbridge, as the sort of pinnacle of success and achievement, and seeing everything in a sort of hierarchy below that. I think we're probably will hear, and I think the United States share that. Those sort of cultural biases, less so in continental Europe. In the Germanic countries, the Scandinavian countries, there is more historic valuation of kind of practical intelligence and craft and so on. And I think, but I mean, these things can be reversed. I think this is. I mean, it is also, I think, a decent spirit of not wanting to kick away the ladder. The feeling that I've benefited from this experience, that there is something privileged about it. Can't everybody have it? Well, no. I mean, just logically, not everybody can have it.
But the neglect, David, the neglect of the other side.
Yeah,
I think there's a real link. But if you look at the composition of Parliament.
Yeah, well, that's true, and particularly the Labour Party. I mean, the fact that Tony Blair was able to make that speech in 1999, saying 50% of school leavers should go to university. I mean, the lack of emotional intelligence. It's what I call the 15-50 problem.
Yes,
when 15% of people in your class or town go to university and you don't, it doesn't really matter. You go and work in a local office or factory, life goes on. But if nearly 50% do and you don't, then it's a completely different psychological ballgame. And nobody around Tony Blair, attached to the party that's meant to represent the working class, or was then, it didn't seem to.
No, it didn't have a flicker.
No,
they didn't see that at all. They didn't, and their focus wasn't on that. They thought it was a social mobility. I mean, you go back to the 70s. We had a reasonably well functioning set of alternatives to higher education. You could do BTECs at school. We had polytechnics that gave some prestige to the sort of higher manual technical skills. And focused on those as well.
Yeah.
And that was what they did.
But then, this sort of cultural draw, the polytechnics were desperate for the extra prestige associated with the classical university experience. I mean, like I say, I mean, I'm not in favour of closing the universities down, but
shrinking.
But well, and creating. We're outliers in higher education in two respects. One, the proportion of people we send to residential universities, which I think does have I mean, I wrote about that a little in The Road to Somewhere. I think it has certainly has had an influence on the value divides. You join a complete. You no longer continue to be friends with the plumbers and electricians who you might have gone to school with. It creates a greater divide.
It's this idea that to get on, you've got to get out.
Yeah,
that's the point. And it's very harmful for the hinterland towns that lose their very best.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Michael Merrick's made a point, actually. I think it was probably tongue-in-cheek, actually, but he said, at the moment we pay people the very best to leave, Rotherham or Blythe, whatever. We pay them to get out.
Yeah.
Have you thought about paying them to stay?
Yeah.
Tongue-in-cheek.
Well, I make that point in my book too. I mean, just to level out the playing field. Because not only do we reward people, we have a far higher subsidy. All of the everything is so simple if you're going down the university path. There's this great motorway with huge signs on it and great financial incentives. I mean, we subsidise higher education even with tuition fees. We subsidise it thanks to the generous loan scheme far more than. We subsidise it far more than other forms of post-school education. Yeah. And actually, the great thing about the Boris Johnson speech the other day is saying, we're going to level that. Yes. So everybody can be entitled to a 3-4 year loan for any kind of post-school education. I think that's a really, really important speech and really big, the most important speech about higher education since Blair's 50% speech in 1999.
Interesting. Blair's very interesting because it's not well known. I'm pretty sure I'm right that the Blair government in the first term, till 2001, actually spent less on education as a percentage of GDP than the Major government did. Because you had a little bit of economic growth. Check it, I think it's true. Yeah. Can I just return to one thing? I just want to link it because I'm interested in why we've neglected trade and craft and why hasn't there been enough political pressure to get those things done, to train kids? Now, I think one of the reasons was the model that we operated, certainly when we were in the European Union, was a model based on open access and a large labour market of 600 million people. And I think they just, successive governments simply relied on the size of that market and the mobility of labour to neglect domestic or domestically focused training. So we didn't bother to train anyone because we would always lean on high levels of immigration to fill the gaps. And I think the political problem was that the people that had their feet held to the fire with that were people with fewer skills. And I don't think that would have happened to the same extent if, for example, if British lawyers were held to the same thing. I think that's a political problem. I think to some extent it's linked to. I mean, there's no doubt. I'm sort of take a centre-left view on this. I think a very large labour market, open labour market, will depress wages, and I think it certainly acts as a disincentive to train. I
think immigration has been part of the story. I think the decline of trade unions were always great defenders of skill, partly in a rather reactionary way of sort of skill differentials. Indeed, it's one of the reasons why the Conservative government in the late 70s, early 80s, David Willits was actually in the front line of this, now the architect of the modern university system. I mean, he helped destroy the traditional apprenticeship system, partly because, on the reasonable grounds that the apprenticeship system was producing skills that were no longer necessary. And this whole shift towards, away from specific skills for specific industries towards general skills. And it fitted also with the sort of shift towards child-centred progressive education, the sort of the teaching of these sort of general skills, critical thinking and all of these kinds of fashionable things. It sort of fitted into that generalist notion of being prepared for a life of constant change, and an overwhelmingly service economy where these kind of manual technical skills are a little bit passé anyway.
But they sat on a skills gap and did nothing about it. And I think there's political salience in it because I think the interests that should have been represented by the Labour Party simply weren't. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons. I mean, certainly if you put if you advertise for a fully competent mechanical engineer on Tyneside now, you will get you'll get applicants from very older sort of marine engineers in their 50s and 60s, time served, and then you'll have you know, some European immigrants speak very, very few.
Well,
young Brits that have the skills to change a pipe.
And it's not, you know, and this isn't that hard to fix. I mean, I think it is one of those things that's been neglected for all sorts of cultural reasons. Perhaps that not enough people are impacted at any given time. I mean, it's perhaps a little bit like social care. You know, why have we spent sort of 20 years before really putting our back into reforming social care? And similarly with this. But I think this government does seem to have the bit between its teeth on this. It's part of the levelling up agenda. You know, it's how do we produce more people with these sort of level 4, so-called level 4, 5 skills, you know, the European jargon. For level 3 is A-levels, level 6 is a bachelor's degree. It's these kind of higher technical, like HNDs, HNCs. Hundreds of thousands of people used to do these, and now it's down to a few tens of thousands every year. So and yet industry is crying out for one of the reasons apparently why the testing system is working very well. It's because we lack the kind of white-coated lab technicians.
Of course. Well, you have degree holders doing that job.
Well, exactly. Either that, or you have people. You know, you have academic scientists doing the job who end up not being very good at it. I mean, this is Paul Lewis at King's is very good on this, because they have expectations of doing kind of higher cognitive work and not doing, you know, but a lot of work in a laboratory is pretty routine stuff, and you have to be, you know, you have to have expectations that fit the work that you're doing. Otherwise, you'll do it quite badly.
I think I think there's no doubt at all there's been a skills gap, and the over-expansion of the universities has been a mistake, and it's cost others. The interesting thing, when you hear Willits and Andrew Adonis the other day having a blind spot to just the basic concept of opportunity cost in this. They just don't get that if you put government resources into higher education, it might cost you elsewhere, and they could flat. Well, and very naively they sort of say, but look, all the kids are choosing it. Well, of course they're choosing it, but the choice is constrained and incentivized. You know, as I was saying earlier, there's this massive, clear, you know, motorway towards it. You know, all the economic and the cultural signals are pointing you towards it. So why wouldn't you do it? What's more, you know, because of the fact that we're overwhelmingly residential. I was going to say earlier, by the way, the two things were outliers. One is residential. You know, and who wouldn't want to leave your home and find themselves?
3 years, you know, at taxpayers' expense partly. You know, having fun. You know, and kids, particularly if they're doing humanities degrees, you know, basically forget everything they've ever learnt there anyway. But it is a wonderful experience.
It's a rite of passage and a growing experience. And
and I think one of the questions is how can we, and it's a valuable thing too. I mean, I think, you know, David Sosky is one of the architects of the 50% target. Sort of now says that actually it's not so much what you learn at university; it's the experience of being there, learning to get on with people very different from you, from different social classes, ethnicities, even, and learning the sort of political skills, you know, how to set up a university society and so on. But perhaps we should be thinking about how to make those kinds of experiences available to people that don't want to. But because residential universities are also very expensive, they have a high cultural cost. So how can we think of other ways of having that experience? But just to finish, the other way in which we are very much outliers in sort of global higher education, or certainly in rich countries, is the kind of undifferentiated nature of our higher education. So, you know, most countries still have kept some version of the polytechnics. They may technically be classified as universities, like the Fachhochschule in Germany are technically universities, but they are, but they're not. I mean, they have many of those people doing those courses. You can do it while you're working. You can do sandwich courses. You can do it part-time. You have that extra flexibility, which our rigid 3-4 year classical academic bachelor degree taught by academics, most of whom want to be doing their research and not teaching. You know, it's full time, and far too much of it is focused on 18, 19-year-olds, many of whom aren't mature enough to appreciate it. Far better to go off and work for a few years. Is a problem.
You speak to anyone at the universities there, the first year. They don't really put much in there because the kids are so young. No, I'm confident about our ability to correct this and rejig it. So you're out of kilter. You can rejig it by reducing one sector slightly and just concentrating on problems. So I think we can do that.
Repurposing, you know, repurposing some of the universities to, you know, to, in a sense, take them back to what they were doing when they were polytechnics, and that that's not impossible, and that's kind of what the government's got this white paper on further education coming up. So one of the I'm actually working on a paper at Policy Exchange at the moment on who should be delivering 4 and 5. Should it be FE or should it be HE? I mean, I think in a way it should be both. It's kind of horses for courses, depending where you are in the country. But that we need to get them to collaborate, and a lot of the incentives in the post-school education system at the moment make it very hard for institutions to collaborate, and you get duplication and
they don't talk to each other actually, even locally.
Well, and culturally, obviously, the HE people are kind of far superior. They have the power, they have the degree awarding powers that many FE colleges don't have. So
But I'm confident we can make progress on this. I think public policy can do that. I just want to talk to you about a more difficult problem in a way, which is the cultural problem, because I think in terms of what we value in society, how we value people and what they do, I think that's very downstream of culture anyway. So I think any adaptation to seriously value what we do with our hands to a greater extent, and how caring professions are considered, and caring in general. How can will some of this just adapt naturally, or do you think there's something we can do culturally to?
Well, I think it will happen naturally. It'll happen partly because it'll have to happen, status is not in the gift of politicians to distribute, except to the extent that status follows the money. To some extent, politicians do have some influence over relative incomes and minimum wages and things like that. And then I think, because there will just simply be a huge demand for more caring jobs, we're going to have to make those jobs more attractive.
Yes.
Partly for, we have these huge recruitment crises both in classical nursing, but also in the more sort of Cinderella service of the adult social care, partly because for the benign reason that women now have many more options than they did 30 or 40 years ago, when most able women ended up as teachers or nurses, and now they can be partners in city law firms, and that means that that there are fewer women doing those jobs, and men haven't on the whole stepped into the breach to do them. But I do I think the cultures do change sometimes very quickly. Britain was meant to be this very sort of social democratic, collectivist, sort of union-dominated society in the 1970s, and suddenly it was a kind of entrepreneurial Thatcherite society. Within
but a lot of that, some of that's glossed though, isn't it? But people do get these zeitgeists. They do affect. They have very, very long and lasting effects. I agree with you, and I think so. What I'd look for is for a rejig. To just value, maybe I want to talk about the pandemic in a second, but just to rejig things. So you might be better off, not only better off and happier and more fulfilled, say, brewing craft ale than you would have been if you'd gone into pharmacy, clicking, in front of a computer all day. Just more fulfilling, better life, actually. And you try, actually you might not earn quite as much, but your colleagues.
I think this is happening. And some of it will be a kind of top-down thing. That often the more privileged kids will say,
I'll give that the flick.
Why should I go to university any longer? Because actually, I'm going to become a sort of artisanal baker or whatever.
It's always bakers or brewers, isn't it? You're glad to bakers and brewers. No, I think you're right, but I just think that could be very important. Culturally, when people start writing about it, it comes back into the culture. It may rejig it a little bit. And
I also think it's to do with measurement. The reason why the cognitive meritocracy has swept all before it is because it appears to be easy to measure.
Yes.
We all read the same biology textbooks, we sit the exam, and assuming they're marked more or less fairly, we're then put in what seems like a kind of fair hierarchy. Some people are very good at it, some people aren't. It's much harder to measure outcomes. But even in manual technical things, although perhaps not quite so difficult there, but really difficult in caring. How do you value the work of a nurse who's just spent a shift on a geriatric ward, making the lives of some very old people a little bit less miserable?
Yes.
It's just very, very difficult to do. I know there are people in the NHS working on how one does it, and this is one of the things with my book is seen as part of this sort of spate of books writing that are critical of meritocracy. But I think I mean, I am critical of meritocracy.
It's a little bit of a myth for a start.
Well, I mean, the idea that if you turn society into a competition that the most able win and most everybody else feels like a failure, that's obviously not an ideal. But obviously everybody accepts, even Michael Young accepted that you have to have meritocratic selection for jobs, particularly
airline
top
pilots,
jobs.
Surgeons, yes.
Exactly,
obviously.
you don't want to be operated on by a surgeon who failed his surgery exams.
But you're right. I think a lot of these things are incommensurable to some extent, and I think a lot of the hierarchies that we've put up are actually false, and we're valuing things wrongly. I mean, I think you see that in every September or season when people go to university. Certainly, the sharp-elbowed rank all the universities absolutely judiciously, and it's, so and they think the relations are transitive. So they think that Durham is better than Exeter, which is better than Warwick. So therefore, Durham is better than Warwick. And it doesn't work. It shouldn't work. It doesn't. That's not real life.
Well, except, I mean, there is, status is always a kind of a relative thing. There will always be hierarchies of ability, and this is. We also have to be realistic about this. This is the point made, I think, by Nietzsche. Just at the dawn of modern democracy, he was pointing out that the democratic ideal, well, indeed the Christian ideal, that we're all equal, morally equal, legally, politically equal, runs up against the fact that we also have a huge range of different abilities,
aptitudes,
and different aptitudes, and so I mean, I don't think we can ever overcome that. We will always, value people who are better singers or better cricketers or whatever than less good singers and less good cricketers.
But different people.
But we can, at the very least, which is really what I'm asking for in this book, is shift what we merit. I mean, or not focus what we merit so much on one narrow set of aptitudes, but open it up to others. And this is why, paradoxically, I'm actually arguing in a way for more meritocracy in areas like care. If you ask an economist, why is it that people in care homes particularly are so badly paid, they'll say because anybody can do it. And they're judging it by a cognitive standard.
It's sort of not true, actually.
Of course it's not true. You spend 5 or 10 minutes in an old people's home or a hospital. Like any walk of life, there are good carers, there are okay carers, and there are crap carers. And yet we don't differentiate.
Yes, no, very good. I think that's right. I think that's right. You mentioned Nietzsche, so I'm going to mention A.J. Ayer on an anecdote which is related to this. So he, famous analytical philosopher and great writer, better writer than Russell, I think, actually, but was wrong about quite a few things. He used to get taken up to see Spurs play by Martin Amis.
Really?
In the car.
Right.
And he's a smoker. And Amos would take him up in the car, and AJ would stub his cigarettes out into the tape deck in the car when they had tape decks in cars, because he thought it was an ashtray. And that's an example of someone that obviously valued massively, as an analytical philosopher, great professor of logic at Oxford, but not terribly practical, because actually some people wouldn't have done that. Can we finish? I want to talk about the pandemic, because you sort of must talk about that. And also I wanted to try and take silver linings from it, because it's an awful thing for humanity and for society. I think it'll have very, very long tail effects, this. But in thinking about silver linings and thinking about rejigging, I think obviously there are silver linings. I think possibly we might learn to value people that are key workers and also keep the basics going. Moving things around. We must value people more for that, and that might be a thing. I also think hasn't the pandemic been a massive window of just possibility?
Absolutely. Yeah. When we collectively underwrite the incomes of however many 10 million workers. That's an extraordinary and almost unthinkable social democratic act.
Yes.
But I think you're right too about, I think it's been quite a communitarian, in some ways small c conservative crisis. If you think of all the WhatsApp groups that have sprung up, probably tens if not hundreds of thousands all over the country to support people voluntary groups in their area, and just the recognition of our interdependence, of our dependence on the people who are normally invisible. I don't mean so much the care of the nurses and the doctors. Obviously, they've been in the front line of it and they've received, but they were quite high status, reasonably well paid people anyway. It's more the shelf stackers in the supermarkets, people we just took for granted.
Essential.
Yeah, and so so many of those key workers, obviously people without university degrees, van drivers, the people that drive the drugs to to Boots.
They were never paid enough. and they were never valued enough. But I mean, it depends actually, because you made the point that nurses are rather well paid, and actually, that's actually true. It's not very popular.
Nurses and teachers are actually
training. If you look at a trainee solicitor as against a nurse, actually, there's very little difference. So we
have quite high minimum wages. We have a quite high minimum wage in this country by international standards. I mean, I'd like it to be a bit higher, but I do think it's not just pay.
About money. No.
It is also about recognition that what you're doing is purposeful and useful. Part of the sort of chain of being in our society. And I think people who worked in supermarkets did perhaps feel a little bit, not all of them necessarily, but I think they felt that they were being sort of seen in a way. They were being recognised in a way that perhaps they hadn't so much before.
That's true. Another thing which I think you say in the book that we've got to be careful we don't see the pandemic through our prejudices and see that through that lens. But I think another thing, an adaptation, a rejig, which might come out of this, is an end or sort of hinge point in this awful sort of free trade liberalism indifference to what is made by whom and where, because that has been a big problem, complete indifference to factory closure and domestic resilience and things. And I just see the pandemic, and I think surely we've got to rejig towards what we've been saying, which is that it really does matter who produces things, and you've got to have sort of a domestic bargain in this, which takes into account producers, not just consumers. Do you agree with that?
No, I do definitely. I mean, the idea that all people care about is the lowest possible price in Walmart. No, actually, people are producers as well as consumers, and and if paying a little bit more for some electronic device in Walmart meant that you actually had a decent skilled job in a factory, then obviously the trade-offs have got to be looked at in the round, not just look at everybody as a consumer. And I think this is. I mean, sort of hyper-globalisation, in Danny Roderick's phrase, was kind of on the retreat anyway, even prior to the pandemic.
Yes.
The pandemic has certainly underlined the virtue of domestic production, certainly things related to pandemics, like PPE equipment and so on. So that, that will... I suspect world trade will bounce back. I mean, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 1930s and have global trade wars, but I think a kind of modest retreat from globalization and a belief that it's not always stupid to produce things at home, even if they cost slightly more.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Roderick. Actually, I think the language he uses, the states. Have to be in a position to make sort of Keynesian social and economic bargains which suit themselves a little bit of flexibility to make your own sort of bargains. So I think that's right. I think another really encouraging thing is I think the young people do get this. So I think if the future entailed your chest of drawers, instead of having 50 cheap T-shirts, you might have 5 that were a bit more expensive, might be made here even, I don't know about T-shirts, but you get the gist. I think young people do understand this, the importance of the environment and long supply chains, shipping stuff around the world, eating vegetables in season.
Exactly, it's all part of the sort of, it's a slowing down, it's sort of getting off the hamster wheel in some ways. I mean, I think a lot of us experienced that, perhaps particularly middle-class people who worked at home. They kind of noticed the people around, they got to know their neighbourhood better. And, got to know some old lady up the road and took her for a walk, perhaps. I mean, and that's all part of the same story in a way of kind of slowing down, getting a sort of better grasp on what is really important.
Yes, family. Often family and friends and locality. So let's end there, David, because I think we should end on a positive, because it has been very difficult. But I think there are immense opportunities looking forward in this to look at what we do and to realise that things can change. And it's awful, Tina. There's that Thatcherite thing, the acronym TINA, there is no alternative. Well, we'd argue for railway nationalisation might cost 6 or 8 billion quid a year or something. No, you can't do that. And suddenly, actually, you can if you want.
But things change very fast. Public opinion shifts around. And that opens up also. Just think about how. Even at a more hard-headed level, think of the business plans of big corporations over the last 20 years and how they've been obviously some more than others, been hugely affected by, say, concerns about the environment, concerns about gender equality. I mean, these things, market signals do not exist sort of separate from human priorities, and those priorities, can and will shift. And I think one of the ways they will shift is in shifting prestige and status more evenly across human aptitudes.
And that aspect is the other side. Again, you have public policy leading it, but I think there may be a natural reorientation happening as well. I think let's end there and hope that happens.
Absolutely.
But can I thank you also for being a friend to the party and what we've done over the last few years, because we're growing and we are making progress steadily, and you've always been a
I'm very happy. I mean, I hope you flourish. I think you're an important strand in British politics.
Very kind. Thank you, David. Cheers.